Danganronpa 3 anime is something you've probably heard about before. Before V3, this was supposed to be the big conclusion to everything. All the storylines, all the themes, and all our questions were supposed to come to a close with this one show. So, how did it actually accomplish this? Did it actually manage to give me the answers to shit I don't care about? Well, find out next week, because we are not talking about that here. Instead, I want to cover its lesser talked about companion piece, Killer Killer. Killer Killer was a manga that was released alongside the DR3 anime. I think it takes place around the events of DRAE, but I'm not entirely sure and I can't be asked to look into it. The story itself follows two detectives working for the now much larger and well-established Future Foundation, as they take on a series of unusual murder cases. The first detective is someone new to the police force named Misaki, while the second detective is a veteran named Takumi. Throughout each case, they have this sort of Holmes and Watson dynamic where Misaki tries to do things by the book, while Takumi does a bunch of dumb shit that eventually leads him to finding the true culprit. This goes on for about half the manga's runtime, until it shifts gears toward an overarching plot involving a serial killer who kills other killers named the Killer Killer.
There it is! There it is!
A bunch of shenanigans ensue until everything comes to a complete and satisfying close. That's right, this is a Danganronpa story with no cliffhangers to bait out 1,000 sequels, it's just closure and nothing else. This book was kind of refreshing, honestly. After going through most of the Danganronpa media for this series, it's nice to have something like Killer Killer where it's short, to the point, and doesn't waste my time with dumb garbage.
However,
this whole thing is an irrelevant cyclone of wild bullshit that, when compared with the rest of the series, kinda blows my mind. If there was ever a point where this series definitively jumped the shark, it's here. Prepare yourselves, for I have journeyed into the abyss, and on the other end were Disneyland fireworks and the Parasite Queen. This is Poopy Poopy. Okay, for real now. What is Killer Killer? Killer Killer is a manga that is way more complicated than it lets on. There are a lot of things going on at once in this story. The most prominent one, and the one I'm going to focus on for the rest of this video, is what I can only describe as a flat-out rejection of Danganronpa as a whole. In DRAE, I alluded to this idea that you can get a read on it being this dark mirror held up to the series. However, I ended up dismissing this idea because it didn't seem like it was that big of a deal. Well, in Killer Killer, it could not be more obvious. But before we can get into that, let me back up for a bit. Earlier, I described Killer Killer as being a series of unusual murder investigations with a Holmes and Watson dynamic going on with the main characters. Well, you see, I actually lied to you. This book is nothing like that at all. You may be led to believe it's like that when you read the first case, but as soon as it tips its hand, you realize this isn't that type of story. In said first case, a murder takes place at this concert hall held by this Buddhist idol named Momomichi, where a bunch of bodies are displayed midway through to shock the audience. Misaki and Takumi are tasked with figuring out how it happened and who did it. Throughout the investigation, Takumi is hugging the bodies, sniffing them, and is just doing a bunch of weird shit. He very clearly is doing things in his own way, and you're left thinking that he's going to explain the method to this madness by the end of it. Well, after some messing around, the end hits where he decides to confront the killer. Up until this point, we still don't know anything about how this crime was committed or who did it. All eyes are on Takumi to explain it for us right here, right now. Well, here's how it goes down. It turns out that the true culprit was the lead singer of the concert. He is a goddamn vampire Chad, a mystic, blood-sucking elf man who has the ability to absorb blood to become younger. He needs the blood, you see, to improve his skin. He has to get the twink gamer skin required to become the ultimate Buddhist idol. But sadly, in his hubris, he made one fatal mistake. The person investigating his crime has a boner for murder. Die, Simon Buddhist Quill. Return to the cubes from whence you came.
Beautiful voice. I hope that you sing some music sometime too. You sound great.
Now you may be a little confused as to how I managed to go from a weird setup for a murder mystery to blood cubes and a concert vampire. Surely there must be context I've removed. And you'd be right. I didn't even mention that all of this happens in the first chapter. Yes, the first chapter. You meet the main characters, they investigate this crime scene, and then this whole reveal about the idol being a vampire man just comes out of nowhere. I wasn't exaggerating at all. All of this really happens. Takumi literally solves an entire case because he really likes murder. And it just goes up from here. In the second chapter, the main villain is a woman who houses parasites in her own body in honor of the Parasite Queen. In the arc that starts in chapters 3 and 4, the killer ends up being a pyrotechnician with the ability to hypnotize you with Disneyland fireworks. Finally, in chapter 7, we get a woman who's the reincarnated samurai simping for this idol in a past life whose soul has somehow managed to end up in the present, and she ends up having to kill this other guy because they're both part of this fan club for the idol, and she feels that she's competing with whatever she He's turned into a chair, okay? He's a chair now. He is a chair with a head. Are you happy? Sit on him, why don't you? I'm not going to go into detail on all the other mini arcs where this craziness happens because there isn't much else I can add beyond just summarizing the whole book to you. But, I mean, come on. Just look at some of these panels. Look at the insanity going on here. There isn't any good context for this either. It's just a bloodbath in this coliseum with psycho murderers watching. They're just kicking each other's asses. This guy fucking dies. Everything is just balls to the wall 24/7. Or check this out. In chapter 9, there's this army of Mercuro Ikusaba cosplayers that just show up out of scenic nowhere and kill everyone. Greetings, I'm Mercuro Ikusaba, the 16th student, and I have now crafted 16 of me to begin my rampage. Ninja art. Shadow Clone Jutsu. Or this. This is the climax of the entire manga. Main girl has a necklace that'll blow up the entire city if she doesn't die. But Takumi cuts her head off so fast, he can remove the necklace, then reattach her head perfectly as if nothing happened, tricking the necklace into thinking that she actually died. Like, duh, if your head is about to explode, just take your head off. It's that simple. But seriously though, how does this reject Danganronpa as a whole? This is where we're getting into the shit that I find a lot more interesting with Killer Killer than I do the actual story itself. To start off this point, I need to establish what Danganronpa was prior to this book before I can explain how it got rejected. By which I mean, we need to take another quick look at the previous entries again. Danganronpa was a series that seemed primarily concerned with the Japanese school system, stifling free expression and thrusting unreal expectations on its students. In the first game, we get a look at a set of characters who are meant to be alien to us. We're only meant to know them on a surface level because the only information we have on them is their talent. This allows us to get an idea for how they're viewed by the world around them because based on how Danganronpa's universe functions, this cursory understanding of how their talents work literally determines the rest of their lives. It's through the free times that we're meant to get a much deeper understanding of who they are as people, realizing that they may have more to their opinions and interests outside of what's expected of them. This type of characterization is also given to us through each killer throughout the game. The rationale behind each murder demonstrates a different vice that's currently plaguing the society they grew up in. We have themes of alienation, toxic masculinity, greed, etc. These characters reflect the world around them, and their actions/concerns give us an idea of how the world they grew up in could have fallen apart when it's revealed at the end of the game. This is why it was really important that the ending of the first game was ambiguous. The future wasn't certain, but through that, there was hope for them to create something better instead of repeating the mistakes that led them to this point in the first place. This was also compounded by the fact that the person helping usher in this newly rebuilt world was someone who defied the school's expectation of a model student, Naigi, someone who didn't have any talent to speak of but was able to grow into his own person by believing in a better tomorrow. Danganronpa 0 expanded on this by introducing the perspective of people who aren't talented. It called into question the narrow criteria that students are judged by through the way the kids are looked down on through the failure students classroom situation. Non-talented kids are treated like second-class citizens. They're understood as having no place in the world because they aren't viewed as providing anything useful. It poses the question, if we're meant to believe that talented kids are supposed to be the hope for the next generation, then what does that make everyone else? By the logic of this world, if you aren't talented, then you're functionally worthless. You're living in the shadows of people who are essentially better than you. It's also made clear that this was an essential part of what Junko used to rally up students to start the riots that kick-started the Big Despair incident. The book highlighted a series of inequalities that, while exaggerated, mirror how someone who's not performing as well in a school system as everyone else might view themselves. Danganronpa 2 finalized all these messages by introducing Nagito and attempting to confront his ideas throughout the game. In short, Nagito reinforces the belief that there exists a difference between talented and untalented students, while the rest of the game seeks to equalize everyone by demonstrating that this belief is incorrect. It does this by consistently pointing out how it was specifically the talents of the students involved that ended up getting them caught for each murder, and the biggest reason why the end of the world even happened. This is also shown through the juxtaposition between Hajime and his original character Blajime the Hedgehog, master of all the chaos talents. Within each of these three titles, we can see a consistent narrative that seeks to explain the current problems with society, how those problems affect the world at large, and how we can move on from these issues. Then, we hit another episode. This is where things start to shift. DRAE is a story that, at face value, tells the story about how the average person can overcome their dire circumstances while simultaneously mocking this idea at the same time. The main point the villains try to make is that Komaru's entire quest to help save everyone is this worthless endeavor, because it was nothing more than a fake hero's journey put on by a group of people using it to manipulate everyone else. There's a huge emphasis put on the fact that she's supposed to despair because her character arc wasn't real, which, on a much deeper level, turns this game from another entry in the series criticizing the evils of the world to a game that questions the validity of storytelling in general. Komaru is the main character of the story who is supposed to fall into despair because her story happened to be a work of fiction. It was a narrative created by a third party that she happened to play out that people resonated with, so much so that she was able to almost cause a lot of deaths in the process. By presenting Komaru's adventure in this way, what the game inadvertently does is call into question the very ideas this series presented in previous games. If hope and despair are meaningless, interchangeable terms in an elaborate work of fiction with no basis in reality, does that mean that we should disregard these themes throughout the other Danganronpa entries because they're ultimately meaningless? To this, another episode says, no, there is still validity in these stories. Komaru's arc may have been fabricated, but her character growth was real. There are still positive outcomes that came out of her adventure. The fact that change was made at all is proof that there's hope for the world so long as the quote-unquote right choices are made. Now, there's a lot more I could say about this ending because I find it insanely stupid and contradictory, but that's not my goal for this video. All I want to do is expose you to the idea that, in another episode, Danganronpa started to confront the idea of its existence as a work of art and what that means for it. In the end, however, it's still ultimately about the struggle for rebuilding the future. Then finally, we have Killer Killer. Oh boy. Like I said before, this manga is very complicated on multiple levels. On one end, it embraces the logical extremes of the messaging established in another episode, but on the other end, it chooses to go above and beyond everything that's come before it. This is the most complex and subversive meta-narrative I've ever seen in Danganronpa. On a surface level, Killer Killer is a story about how we engage with art, where the serial killers are the artists and their murders are the art they produce. There's a recurring theme throughout the book where Takumi is on the lookout for what he calls a passionate killing. As he confronts each culprit, he rates their murder on a scale of 0 to 100 for how close they get to this title. This creates the running gag where, up until the final culprit, where even then the review is ironic, each culprit gets a bad review, leading to their eventual defeat. The overall joke being that the serial killer is being treated as if they are an artist who is failing to produce art in a way that Takumi, the critic, finds appealing. What's fascinating about this joke, however, is that it's actually a lot more complex than how I laid it out. See, if it was as simple as just the characters rating murders for laughs, I probably wouldn't think anything of it. It starts to get a lot more interesting when you factor in how Misaki processes these same events. By analyzing her role in this story, what you'll find is that this joke has a lot more legitimacy to it than you may initially think. Furthermore, it may also reveal another message that's even more complicated than anything this series has done up until this point. Because of how brief my explanation of this story's plot was, those of you who haven't read this manga may not know that there's actually a secondary storyline going on while Takumi confronts these murderers. It all has to do with Misaki. Between our two main characters, Misaki is the average Joe. She reacts to everything with the same set of anxieties you'd expect someone to have when confronted with these situations. Contrasted with Takumi, who's infatuated with murder, she actually views it somewhat normally. Throughout the book, we follow her character arc as she, more or less, attempts to understand Takumi's mindset. Misaki goes from complaining about Takumi's strange behavior to having to confront his love for murder to eventually reaching an understanding where even she too is willing to help him search for his passionate killing. It's through her perspective that this joke about the murder rating starts to become elevated in a way, because now it's no longer just a random gag that occurs every time a new villain shows up. Now it's a central part of this character's arc that carries on throughout the story. It's now a story about someone like Misaki being faced with the work of art she can't understand, that being murder, and having to see it from a new perspective. Her arc is her learning how to engage with it. By proxy, it also gives us a window into this mindset as well, completing this overarching message through this character's point of view. But All of that is obvious to anyone who's read the book, right? This is all surface level shit. No. I'm here to go balls deep. This manga is not meta because it's about engaging with art. It's actually a lot crazier than that. So let's step one layer deeper using what I just said as our starting point. Revisiting Misaki's arc, one important aspect of it is that it's not actually framed around her learning to love murder through her experiences with it. It's actually built off of an ongoing struggle she has where she has to come to terms with Takumi being the killer. For context, the police force is really obsessed with catching the killer, despite the fact he basically helps them accomplish their goals. It's actually so extreme that they use this Coliseum scene I talked about earlier as a ploy to try and out him with the use of an undercover agent and a dummy model of Naigi. The fact that Takumi, someone a part of this same police force, is the killer is actually a huge deal in universe. It's actually so much of a big deal that Misaki has to confront her doubts about Takumi over the course of multiple scenes, starting with the case in the Coliseum and ending near the end of the manga. All of this is important because it changes our conclusion from earlier slightly. Misaki doesn't just struggle with understanding Takumi's art, she struggles with understanding Takumi as an artist. But it doesn't stop there because there's still another layer to this that will cap off this point. Shuji Fujigawa is a character introduced at the halfway point of the story. When Takumi and he were young, they both experienced a pivotal moment where they formed two extreme views on murder. Besides the tragedy, there was another incident that took place sometime around it where Mercuro Ikusaba slaughtered a bunch of random students. Shuji and Takumi witnessed this event from within a locker and subsequently managed to survive. As a result, both of them walked out with two different outlooks on killing. Takumi became passionate about it, while Shuji walked out utterly disgusted. This is important because of the conflict Shuji introduces to the story when he makes his first appearance. At the height of the Mercuro Ikusaba clone thing, he basically threatens to kill Misaki if Takumi doesn't stop being the killer. In doing so, he himself admits to actually being the reason that name exists. While Takumi kills serial killers in an attempt to find a passionate killing, Shuji kills serial killers in an attempt to end all murder. So the questions we're left with are, who really is the killer and what does it mean to be the killer? Is the killer Shuji or Takumi? Does the killer stand for someone who finds beauty in murder or someone who wants to clean it up because of their distaste for it? Is murder disgusting or is it beautiful? And since these two questions are intrinsically tied to characters heavily related to Misaki's arc, she has to answer these questions as well. Because two people are claiming to have the same role and also acknowledge each other as sharing the same role, then that role is defined by both of their actions. In order for Misaki to come to any conclusions about Takumi, she has to reconcile these questions about the killer. And because Misaki is a stand-in for the audience, representing how we interpret art, we're in the same exact position. In order to find any closure in this story, we have to interpret the killer as well, which, if you haven't figured it out already, means we have to interpret Killer the manga too. Meaning, this story isn't just about us interpreting art. It's a story where both the main characters and the audience have to interpret the literal manga itself in order to reach any conclusions about it. The act of artistic interpretation is being captured inside and outside of Killer's universe at the same time because it's using itself and interpreting itself in universe to make a statement about itself outside of its universe that we have to interpret. But come on. We're all gamers. Like I said before, I'm here to go balls deep. Danganronpa has been meta before, but I'm telling you, Killer is on another level. So let's go deeper. If you don't know, the fact that Killer takes place in the Danganronpa universe is actually a big reveal in the third chapter of the book. In it, we see a wink and a nod to the games, where a serial killer manga author recreates the DR murders in his house to use them as reference for his series. It's from here that the curtain is pulled up, and now we know that the force Takumi and Misaki are a part of is actually the Future Foundation mentioned in DR2, and not just some random police force. This is crucial because it once again recontextualizes how we view their roles in this organization. This feeds into another overarching theme of the manga that we're going to discuss at length here, being the importance of roles. As we've discussed previously, titles are very important in this manga. The act of being the killer carries with it baggage accumulated through the legacy of each person who's contributed to it. In the same way, this also applies to Danganronpa as a series. Hope and despair, Junko Enoshima, and the struggle of surviving in the despair apocalypse are all present in this manga. There are even moments where we can see these messages echoed from high-ranking members of the Future Foundation, where they admit that they want to crush despair alongside shots of the remnants of despair, who even managed to make an appearance as well. This means that both Killer the manga and Killer the character both carry with them the legacy of the works that came before them, which means by proxy of being part of the Future Foundation, our main characters are automatically exactly aligned with their views. With that being established, we now have all the tools we need to understand what this manga is really about. No more extra layers, we're about to dive in. First of all, everything I set up about Misaki's arc was actually incredibly misleading. For the earlier segments, I focused a ton on understanding art and the killer. While this is important, and I didn't lie to you or anything about it, where I was a little vague was how we were supposed to interpret her conclusion. Before, I said that Misaki has to come to an understanding about the killer in order to reconcile where she stands in relation to Takumi. What I left out was how she actually does this. To expand on the necklace thing I talked about earlier, the entire crux of this conflict was that this necklace was set to trigger a series of bombs around the city if she wasn't killed. This is all set up by Shuji to force Takumi to stop being the killer. It is from the start of this arc to its conclusion where Misaki makes a decision about Takumi himself regardless of the killer role. In the process of doing this, we see her asking Takumi to make her his final passionate killing, as well as points where she has to personally vouch for him in front of the Future Foundation who aren't being cooperative. Now there are two major points to these moments and the events that happen between them whose overarching meaning kind of blows my mind. The first takes place when Misaki has to vouch for Takumi in front of the others and while she tries to relate to him on his passion for murder. At this point, the main thing she ends up doing is focusing on Takumi as a person. Her arc ends with her removing him from the role of the killer and treating him as an individual. This carries over to the second big moment at the end of the story when Shuji's been killed off. Takumi ends up fading into the shadows. As a result, he ends up leaving the Future Foundation since he's a wanted killer. But true to his promise that he would kill Misaki, he does a funny reveal near the end where he comes back and quote-unquote kills her by living out the rest of his days with her as a couple. They call it the lover's suicide. This ends with both of them leaving the Future Foundation and running off together. So what do these two moments mean for us? Well, if we track all the symbolism we've established up until this point, we come to one final conclusion. Misaki and Takumi, in this moment, literally left Danganronpa as a series. Killer is about understanding itself as a manga and how it completely abandons the entire universe of the series that it takes place in. Misaki's character arc is one about shedding labels. Takumi is the killer, but he's not as bad as the Future Foundation makes him out to be. In order to run off with him, she has to reject the Future Foundation's beliefs that he's evil. This is because she comes to understand the person behind the label. Takumi is someone who loves murder, but he loves it in his own way, and through her understanding of his passion, she can distance him from the baggage associated with him being the killer. This is all the more fitting, especially when the label dies with Shuji, as he's the last stepping stone to fulfilling his ultimate goal. After killing him, he finds his passionate killing through Misaki. In a way, alongside Shuji, the old label of the killer symbolically dies with him, which is even more impactful when you realize that this is also the moment Killer as a manga comes to an end. When Takumi and Misaki's old boss finds the letter announcing their leave, it's signed by the killer. But after everything we've seen, that label now has a completely new meaning. It's become something in and of itself, separate from what the Future Foundation wants it to be. From a metaphorical lens, because Misaki represents the audience attempting to understand Killer through itself, this story turns into one where we have to simultaneously shed the label surrounding this manga in order to understand it. When our characters run off together, they're not only rejecting the Future Foundation, but they're rejecting everything Danganronpa stands for, as they're essentially represented through this foundation. All the themes about hope and despair that the characters are eternally locked in all goes out the window when two characters find meaning outside of this endless struggle. The signing of the killer on the note carries a different meaning because we're meant to understand Killer as its own story. This is a manga that rejects the realism and melodrama established in every single title that's come before it. Killer isn't just another story about hope versus despair. It's a goofy love story about two characters who gain self-actualization in their own series. At the heart of Danganronpa's world is one event that defined all other events that spawned from it, that being the Big Despair incident. In a similar way, both Takumi and Shuji were defined by an event just like it. When Mercuro went on a killing spree, both of them walked out with two different interpretations of her actions. In the same way themes about hope and despair were derived from the tragedy, our two interpretations of murder were also derived from the massacre Shuji and Takumi witnessed. You can even see this link in the characters' color schemes, where Shuji is white and Takumi is black, which correspond to both halves of Monokuma. They are intrinsically tied to this series. So it's only fitting that, to cap it all off, both sides, white and black, Shuji and Takumi, hope and despair, eventually abandon the story, leaving behind everything else with it. And to be honest, that's why this story blows my mind. But we didn't talk about the most important character, baby! Check it out. This girl can do deductions in her sleep. I bet you didn't know that, bitch. You wish you could think in your sleep. Look at me. I'm a Chad. I take naps. Also, I solve crimes. Didn't even have to wake up. It's called being a gamer. Learn it. There are a few scenes that take place before Takumi and Misaki run off together. What we get are a series of panels showing characters and events that were relevant in the Danganronpa 3 anime, continuing their work to rid the world of despair. Now, the anime had ended for a good while at this point, since the manga was slower to publish than the amount of episodes released, but even so, I think they're still worth talking about. While these panels are meant to act as a series of images acknowledging where the story goes from here, it's almost depressing in a way. Given everything we've talked about, these panels mean something completely different. They're almost a sign of this series' stagnation. Danganronpa just continues to truck on as this soulless derivative husk. It can only ever work within the same tired framework it's always had, while two characters in this manga have managed to escape this endless cycle by finally creating the meaning that has always been missing from this series. They effectively made hope and despair finally mean something, but they kept that meaning for themselves and ran off with it. Killer Killer is a manga that revels in its irrelevance. The reason it didn't continue the story is because it was never meant to. Instead, what we have is a Danganronpa story with more heart than anything this series has ever produced. It's a story that tries to, and in my opinion succeeds, at avoiding the pitfalls that led us here in the first place. I like this book. I had fun reading about the characters, seeing the weird shit that happens, and its overall messaging. I don't think there will ever be another Danganronpa that can pull off what this manga did ever again. Any other attempt at subversion, especially on this level, would be more insulting than anything. Killer Killer is good for what it is, and I'm glad I read it. So, in conclusion, should you take Danganronpa Killer Killer seriously? Well, I think so. And with that, I'll see you in the anime review.